Okay, thank you. Um, Hi, everyone. My name is Don Albrick. I'm the director of the Western Rural Development Center, located at Utah State University in Logan, Utah. We have with us today Dr. Amanda Weinstein of the Department of Economics at the University of Akron. Um, this project, we have had a series of energy-related projects that ended up with 7 different NARDAP policy briefs, and then each of the authors followed up the policy brief with a chapter that's been published in a book titled Our Energy Futures, published by Routledge Press. It just came out this summer. And so we're pleased to have with us Amanda, who is a co-author of one of the chapters with Mark Partridge of Ohio State. And so I'll just turn the time over to you, Amanda.
Hi, thank you. So I just want to say apologize ahead of time for my voice right now. It's a little bit scratchy getting over a cold right now. Uh, sorry about that. So this is a project I've been working on for a while with Mark Partridge. I actually started working on this shale issue with Mark Partridge while I was at Ohio State, and I've continued to work on looking at what the economic impacts are of shale around the country. So this is some of the work that I've done with Mark on shale. So it's actually an interesting project to work on because it wasn't a project that I expected to work on, and it also wasn't something that a lot of people would have expected would be a project at all, because the energy industry, when it comes to this, has taken such a dramatic turn. So there's been these innovations in hydraulic fracturing and microseismic technology and in horizontal drilling, which have really reversed these trends of rising oil and gas imports, and it's opened up these previously uneconomical shale plays to oil and gas drilling across the U.S. So it's really been pretty dramatic and rather unexpected. Since this has been happening, the U.S. oil and gas production has been steadily increasing, and we can actually see that in the trends, which I'll show in a couple slides. And the U.S. is actually now expected to be the largest natural gas producer and largest oil producer in the world, which is pretty dramatic. So this is just a map showing the shale plays across the U.S. And you can see the pink areas are the shale plays I was talking about. So they're shale plays that we always knew were there, but the oil and gas that was there just wasn't economical to get. So what hydraulic fracturing really did is, along with horizontal drilling and these microseismic technology, is allowed the natural gas and oil that are in these shale plays to become economical. So some of the shale plays I'll just kind of highlight here. The Bakken is probably one. I'll point to it here. Let's see if I can do this. The Bakken up here in North Dakota is one that many people have probably heard about. They have the second largest recoverable oil source. The largest is actually in Monterey in California. The Eagle Ford is another one that you may have heard about. But the Barnett's been kind of the largest, has had the largest impact from shale plays across the U.S. because of its recoverable oil. Another one you might have heard about is the Marcellus. It's over here in the Pennsylvania, Ohio, West Virginia area, and it's the source of the largest recoverable natural gas in the U.S. So this slide is just showing you oil production from shale. So we can see right around 2005, oil production from shale is dramatically increasing. And you can see the Bakken that I pointed out there is shown in this kind of beigey color, that the biggest increase really has been from the Bakken. And then this next graph is showing you the natural gas production from shale. So again, around 2005, we can see that natural gas production is dramatically increasing. And you can see the Marcellus there is in pink that I pointed out. We also have the Haynesville, which is in Texas. But there's shale plays across the U.S. that have shown, impact from this shale gas production. And then accompanying this rise in production is, of course, employment. We need someone to actually do the drilling. So we can see that there's been this also dramatic rise in oil and gas employment. And there's also been lower oil and gas prices in the U.S. because of this, which have benefited energy consumers across the U.S. So just a brief overview of hydraulic fracturing if you're not sure what hydraulic fracturing is. So I like this slide. It just kind of gives an overview of the whole process. So basically, what you're seeing here is after the well has been drilled, the actual hydraulic fracturing occurs when you have trucks, so it shows kind of the trucks there driving in water. And so about 1.8 million gallons of water is actually pumped down this well. And then what happens then is there, you can see there's little fissures down there, is this water and mixed with chemicals and additives actually causes this shale to fracture. And when it fractures, it releases the gas or oil, whatever resources are down there, which come back up the well and are extracted for energy purposes. And then the well, there's a pit, so it shows a little pit there. So then there's also produced water that comes up from it, has to be disposed of usually in an injection well, or it's stored for a while before it can go in an injection well. So that's just a brief overview of the hydraulic fracturing process. I can go into it a little bit more at the end if anybody is curious about it. So general stages of development. So actually first, before they can actually do the hydraulic fracturing, they have to pick the site. And this includes, leasing agreements. So typically this land is owned by someone, and the company will lease this land from a landowner and pay them some amount, per acreage for their land. And then they'll also get royalty payments once they are taking natural gas or oil, whatever is coming out of the ground. After they've leased the land, there's site preparation, in constructing the drill pad. This is usually about 1 to 2 months. And then there's the actual drilling process. So that's when they're actually drilling that hole that you saw there. And this includes the rig work and that horizontal drilling that you saw. This takes about a month. And then the actual hydraulic fracturing process only takes about 2 to 5 days. And then there's disposal of the contaminated water. And then once the well has been tapped, you have this oil and gas extraction can actually last for up to 30 years. But really the flow rates are the highest in the first few weeks, or in the first time period. And so that first picture there is showing you what a horizontal drilling tower looks like. And that one's actually in Pennsylvania. And then the second picture there is showing you a capped well. So once the well is capped, you might not, even driving by that well, you might not even know that it was there. So this basically gives you a good idea of what these stages of development are to actually do this shale development, because it gives you a little idea of where this economic impact is going to come from. So when we're talking about the economic impact, and we're talking about the cost now, so we have a lot of these benefits such as lower energy prices. Everybody gets across the nation. We all can benefit from these lower energy prices. But a lot of the costs are actually more localized. When we talk about the costs, these local areas are the ones that are actually doing the drilling. So they're the ones that are actually going to experience the strain on infrastructure, the strain on public services. So I showed a lot of trucks there bringing in the water. So it's really going to put a strain on the roads in the area. If you have a lot of workers coming in, that puts a strain on the public services. If they have kids coming with them, the school system, that type of thing. And then also there's some environmental, costs that go along with this too. So these local areas are the ones that are going to be experiencing these costs. So it's important for these local areas to also know what the benefits are, so that they can then weigh all of the costs against all of the benefits of shale, to kind of figure out if this is something that they want to be, promoting, or something that they want to even allow, as some areas like New York don't allow hydraulic fracturing. So what we need to do to get an estimate of these benefits is we need to create this counterfactual. So this counterfactual helps us estimate what would have happened had there been no shale development at all. So the difference between what did happen and that counterfactual gives us that impact. And that's really what we're looking for here. We're looking to see what would happen had these areas that have already done shale development, what happened if they didn't do shale development at all? And then to find out what was the benefit they actually got from this. And we're typically focusing here on what was the employment benefit, what are the jobs we care about, what's the earnings benefit, and that generally we're looking at the economic benefit here. So a lot of studies have actually come out. They're typically called impact studies. But even a well-done impact study doesn't create that counterfactual that I just talked about. And so a well-done impact study really just talks about the jobs that are supported. And some of the impact studies that have come out, so one, for example, from Pennsylvania, reported that there were 140,000 jobs created from shale development. Another one said that if Ohio followed suit, as Pennsylvania has done with shale drilling, then they could expect about 200,000 jobs to be created from shale development. And even a more recent study said that if California started shale development, as much as 2.8 million jobs would be resulting from shale development. And then so following these impact studies is we start to get these media reports on what the economic impact of shale would be. And just for an example, one here in Ohio, in Columbus, actually reported the CEO of one of these energy companies said that this will be the biggest thing in the state of Ohio since the plow. I mean, that's a pretty bold statement to be making. When you see numbers like that, you can see kind of why he's making that statement. But when we saw, media reports and these impact studies, we were really concerned that these job numbers might be overinflated by the industry. And it's typically this happens with any industry. Any industry wants to, talk about their job benefits, um, to garner support from, the, local politicians and that type of thing. So with these impact studies, what they're really doing is it's an input-output type methodology. And I won't go into a lot of the details about input-output methodology, but basically what you're looking at is they're looking at the number of jobs that are supported by an industry. So they're not typically the number of jobs created by an industry. So that's an important distinction to make here. And so what they're looking at is they're looking at first the direct jobs. So these are the jobs directly related to oil and gas jobs. So when we talked about those stages of development, these are the people that are on the ground, that are drilling the gas, that are creating the drill pad, that are trucking in the water. All of these jobs directly related to drilling and extracting this oil and gas. But then you have more jobs than just those jobs. So when you have all of the oil and gas jobs coming into this local area, you also have what's called this multiplier effect. And this multiplier effect comes from these indirect jobs and induced jobs. So indirect jobs are jobs kind of indirectly associated with the industry. And then the induced jobs are jobs like now we need more waitresses to work at restaurants, or we need more bartenders or people to work in hotels, because now we have all these people coming into the area and they eat at restaurants or they stay at hotels or they go to these bars. And so that creates jobs in those other industries. So once we add up all these jobs, all the direct jobs and indirect jobs and induced jobs, we get the total number there. So, the 1 + 1 = 2. So we get that multiplier effect. So basically that says for every oil and gas job, we get an additional indirect and induced job to give us a total multiplier effect of 2 there. While in these impact studies, so the one for Pennsylvania example, well, we looked what the direct oil and gas employment was over this time period. And it was about 26,000 total oil and gas jobs, and this is adding about 10,000 jobs. So remember, they said that that this industry was associated with about 140,000 jobs, but only 10,000 of those jobs in that time period were created as a direct result from this oil and gas industry. So their own study, would then apply that this has a multiplier of about 14. Well, if you're not familiar with a lot of these multiplier studies and these impact estimates, 14 is actually a very large number. So typically for an industry like this, a multiplier that's more reasonable that we see is pretty common is 2. 2 is a pretty, reasonable multiplier for this. And so what we actually found is that number 140,000 for Pennsylvania was a little bit unrealistic, and it should have been closer to 20,000. And similarly for Ohio, we found that Ohio really should expect a similar impact to Pennsylvania, and they should expect an impact of about 20,000 jobs, not the 200,000 jobs that some impact studies were, first saying. And how we did that is we simply looked at oil and gas employment. So we found out what that oil and gas employment was, and then we multiplied that by a reasonable multiplier of about 2 to get that 20,000 is how we did it. And then so once our study came out, there's more additional data came out. So this next slide is just showing this additional data. So with that red line there, you can see this is Pennsylvania's natural gas, oil and gas related employment. And then at the bottom here is Ohio's. So in this study, or in this graph, Ohio actually makes a really nice counterfactual for Pennsylvania. Ohio went ahead with shale development, but not until about 2012 was when the first drilling rig went in. So Ohio and Pennsylvania are pretty similar before this kind of shale boom started. And so we can compare Pennsylvania to Ohio. So we can assume if Pennsylvania didn't do any drilling at all, it would look close to Ohio. It would look similar to Ohio. But it decided it did do drilling. And because it did drilling, we can see that impact it had. It had a positive impact on this direct oil and gas employment. And we can then see what that impact was. How many oil and gas jobs did they gain? Multiply that times that multiplier of 2, and that gives us our multiplier effect. So once we add this data in for this 2010 to 2011 year, we get that the total effect is about 38,000. So putting this in perspective, so Pennsylvania, let's start with Pennsylvania. So Pennsylvania's unemployment rates have actually increased over this time period from about 5.4% in 2004 to about 7.5% as of May in 2013. So even though they've had, excuse me, so even though they've had growth in the oil and gas industry, and then also growth from that multiplier effect that we talked about, it's still not having a large impact on Pennsylvania because Pennsylvania has a large economy, and the oil and gas employment is just a small sector of that economy. So, and it's only about 0.64% of the economy in 2011 for Pennsylvania. So also to put it in perspective, we look at North Dakota. So North Dakota, that's what I pointed out to you that had the Bakken shale play. And that Bakken shale play has actually had the most pronounced shale boom. They've had just the most dramatic impact from shale development. So to show you how dramatic, their mining employment, this is including coal, went from about 3,600 in 2003 to 24,000 in 2013. So they gained a whole lot of jobs in this industry. So during the same time period, they gained just over 100,000 total jobs. So even if you assume that every new job in this state was somehow related to shale, either directly, indirectly, or induced, so think about that multiplier effect, which is highly unlikely, but let's just assume now that it is, then that would give a multiplier of just over 5. So that puts it in perspective of that initial impact study that had a multiplier of 14. Even North Dakota, assuming every job came from shale somehow, which again, highly unlikely, still is a multiplier of just over 5. So this is showing you some of this dramatic impact from these states. So at the bottom there again is Ohio, so you can kind of compare these states to Ohio. So you can see that a number of states have been doing shale development, and have been gaining direct oil and gas jobs, and have been seeing this benefit from oil and gas. But North Dakota has been the most dramatic. So on this, what this graph is showing you is it's putting every state, it's baselining it at 100 at the year 2005. So that's when the boom, this kind of shale boom started. And so we can see there how, then we can then compare the states to see how they grow over time. And I separate the charts out into kind of every other state, and then the next chart shows you North Dakota. And I separate them out because North Dakota is just dramatically larger. So if we look at the scale here, so the highest that even Arkansas gets is about 220. So we can see it's grown a lot, but North Dakota, by comparison, has grown a whole lot more. This is the largest boom. This state has been experiencing the most pronounced shale boom of any state. And now we can see what that's done to their unemployment rates. So this top line here is the United States unemployment rate, just to give you a comparison. And then this green one here is the Pennsylvania's unemployment rate. And then the bottom one is North Dakota. So, and again, shale development, remember, started right around 2005, so right around this time period here. And so we can see, in terms of unemployment rates, these shale states seem to be, pretty unaffected or barely affected by shale development. So North Dakota has a low unemployment rate, but it kind of always has had a low unemployment rate. It might be slightly lower now because of shale, but not hugely lower. It's always had a low unemployment rate. And Pennsylvania has followed similar trends to the U.S. all along. In the recession, maybe it had some benefits there, a little bit lower than the U.S. now. But again, it's not, in terms of unemployment rates, it's not having a dramatic impact. And so this is actually not surprising to us as economists. So it's not surprising again because I mentioned how this industry is such a small share. So even in North Dakota, where it's a pretty large share compared to other states, and they've had a more dramatic boom, it's still under 6% there in terms of its share of the total economy. North Dakota's economy is just bigger than mining. And we shouldn't really expect an industry that has such a small share of the economy to really have that large of an impact in total. So additionally, this is a capital intensive industry. So I showed you that picture of that large drilling rig. So capital intensive as opposed to labor intensive means, more of this output is going towards that capital, that large drilling rig you're seeing in that truck, not necessarily towards jobs. That's not necessarily a bad thing. It's just a characteristic of this industry. So other findings that Kelsey, excuse me, that Kelsey in Pennsylvania has found that about, so we talked about how these landowners are getting leasing payments and royalty payments. So this is a big windfall for these landowners. And a lot of this money does go to the local area and does go towards helping to kind of revive somewhat these areas. But really, most of that money, about 55%, he finds, is saved. So we can already take 55% of this kind of windfall earnings off the table in terms of going into the local economy. And then in terms of jobs, so in terms of jobs, a lot of these jobs go to out-of-state workers. And so not necessarily to local workers needing a job. So that again kind of, depresses the impact, or, minimizes that impact we might expect. And then finally, we have some displacement effects and other negative effects. So if there's any negative effects associated with, uh, any perspective on this area in terms of its environmental impact, or it could be displacing other industries, that could also be limiting the impact that we see of this industry. So far we've been talking about the state level. So a lot of the reasons why, this industry hasn't had such a dramatic impact on the state is because it's such a small industry of these large state economies. So we would expect, though, that this industry would have a larger impact on smaller economies, such as a county level. So we then checked the counties to see, well, what do these counties get, the ones that are actually doing the drilling, not just the state level. And so we looked at similar counties in Pennsylvania, and we looked at non-drilling counties to similar drilling counties. And we found that, yes, there was an employment impact, but the employment impact was pretty modest. And then the earnings impact was actually double the impact of the employment impact. And some other studies have actually corroborated this. So there's a study by Weber and this Brown 2014. He found that multiplier effect of 1.7. And then I also did a study on counties across the U.S. and found the multiplier was actually closer to 1.3. So recall when I did our estimate before, I estimated the impact of about 2. And so more rigorous studies have since found that actually 2 is actually a pretty generous multiplier, and the multiplier might be smaller, like 1.7 or 1.3. So we find generally, yes, there's an employment impact. There's positive employment earnings impact on the county and also the state, but it's pretty modest. It's not this dramatic impact we first saw. And as we start to think of the long run, I want to point out, go back to North Dakota. So Williston, North Dakota is where this shale boom has been focused on in North Dakota, in Williams County. And they've dramatically increased their mining employment there. But along with the dramatic increase in mining employment, they've also dramatically increased their per capita income. So that increased from 166%, increased 166% from 2005 to 2011. But along with the increase in earnings has been increasing in housing prices. So it's difficult to find housing there, or affordable housing there. And it's also their roads have been dilapidated and their schools have been overcrowded. So some of those costs I've talked about at the local level. And so as we think about the long run, we need to think about those costs as we go into the future. So Williston is actually worried, if in some of the media reports have reported, that they're actually worried about what might happen if this boom ends. And so they're worried because what happened about 30 years ago is Williston in Williams County, North Dakota, did have a boom. So we actually had the energy boom of the 1970s. So you can see Williston is this gray line right here. Williston had a boom before. And then what followed this boom is this bust. So this black line shows you where the U.S. is at in terms of employment growth over time. So Williston was booming in this boom, and then they had this bust to where they were doing, pretty poorly compared to the U.S. And then they didn't actually do better than the U.S. until they got to the most recent shale boom, which is a pretty dramatic boom, as you can see there. And so we can see that we've had these energy booms in the past, and they've been followed by busts. And Williston especially has seen this happen. And so they're worried about what's going to happen in the future and what's going to happen in the long run. So when we think about the long run, one thing that we think about is this natural resource curse. So we call it a natural resource curse because it's pretty unexpected that this energy development, which has this positive impacts on employment and earnings in the area, in the long term has actually been found to be a negative thing for, first it was looked at countries, and then actually even U.S. states and counties. It's found this kind of natural resource curse has been found. And this is because these areas have, lower industry diversity. They're relying on one industry. They have high wages. Those high wages that I pointed out could crowd out other industries that are relying on these low wages. And there's lower incentive for higher education if you have, relatively well-paid, low-skilled jobs. And then you could also have problems with institutions. So governments, spending too much of this money that's coming in and getting used to this high level of spending. So basically, what we're thinking about here is, we're concerned that these initial impacts are just too high, and we need to be realistic with what these impacts are in the short run. So we need to have a realistic measurement of what the employment and earnings impact is and what the benefit is for these local areas so that they can then think about the long term. And as they think about the long term, they need to think, how can they use these short-term benefits, these employment benefits, these earnings benefits, the money that they're bringing in from taxes from these industries, and how can they put them to good use to make sure that we're, covering some of the local costs that I talked about with these industries, and then thinking about even longer term, preventing that resource curse that's been noticed. So making sure that we're doing things like maintaining these public resources and infrastructure, mitigating any environmental costs, and then also an important thing to be investing in the local human capital in the areas. I talked about that disincentive for education, and that we're making sure that their economies are diverse, so that they have to worry less in the long run about what this industry is doing. And thank you very much for your time. And I can take questions now.
Well, thanks, Amanda. That was very interesting romp through all of the issues around fracking. Lots of things to talk about there. Few little things that I don't know if they're things you need to respond to now or maybe thinking about in the future. It struck me, that you mentioned that, for example, the Pennsylvania landowners were saving 55% of their windfall. It might be interesting to look at what happens to the other 45%. I would assume that maybe a larger proportion than usual would be spent on luxury goods. And so if you're putting this into an input-output kind of framework, the ratio of locally purchased goods out of that 45%, I think, would be smaller than the typical, estimate.
Yeah,
So,
you're exactly right. I mean, if you think about, a lot of these areas are pretty rural and remote. So if they want to go buy that, brand new luxury car, for example, they're not going to buy it in their local area. They're going to have to go to the, largest town nearby. And actually another thing with that other 45%, is a lot of it actually goes towards mortgages. So they have mortgages on their house, and so a lot of them will pay off their mortgages, which doesn't necessarily, there's only so much money also you can spend in these local areas. A lot of these local areas just have, small grocery stores, bars, maybe a few places to shop. There's kind of only so much money you can spend in these local areas.
of course, if they're paying off their mortgage, then long term, they might be spending more in the local economy, because they don't have that mortgage payment, 15 years later, so that it could be that their propensity to spend locally would go up sort of permanently, but over a much longer time period with that. On the other hand, they might, these are wintry places, and if they're farmers, they may, if they're crop farmers, they may just buy a house in Florida and be gone all winter. So the windfall might reduce their expenditures permanently, if they disappear for 4 months of the year. So,
Yeah, that's
some,
interesting. We've talked about that. Yeah, so I don't know if that's the case, but I think that'd be interesting to see if they did that.
yeah. And then on the North Dakota thing, again, with the implant framework, there's an assumption of no slack in the economy. And of course, you showed the unemployment figures there for Pennsylvania were quite high, so some slack available. Let me scroll back to that. So there was slack available in the Pennsylvania economy, so people
Right.
might not hire based on this shock. They might just use their existing workers because they're not fully utilized because of the slack. Whereas here, they're pretty close to full employment, so you'd expect that shock to be higher because because of the being close to full employment. So kind
Yeah,
of a
you're
higher
definitely right.
multiplier. The other thing
Yeah.
about, go ahead.
So another thing, yeah, so we would definitely expect the multiplier to be higher in North Dakota. And actually, so I didn't present it here, but some research that I'm doing is actually looking at the multiplier, how it differs by region. And that's exactly what I found, that the multiplier is higher for an area like North Dakota than for Pennsylvania. Even though both areas, so even Pennsylvania will still have to get some workers from out of state, just simply because of skill requirements. So a lot of these workers are coming from Texas that are, have clearly a lot of drilling. So we'll still have to come from out of state.
Yeah, and that kind of ties into another thing. I was up in Fargo a few weeks ago, and of course, you showed on the map the epicenter in North Dakota is really quite a ways from. Let me see if I can get to your Williston map. Uh, so the epicenter of this is quite a ways from Fargo. Let me grab
Right.
my pointer for everybody. Where'd the pointer go? Okay, there it is. No, it's not. They're okay. Now I've got it. So here's Fargo, and here's the epicenter, Williston. So you would not really a priori expect a lot of impacts in Fargo, but and this is anecdotal, but it's interesting to think about and see if it's I don't know if you could prove it or not, but they were telling me that what was happening was the workers were coming in from Texas. The families didn't want to live in Williston.
Mm-hmm.
So, the worker was going to be in a man camp in Williston, and then the families were moving into apartment complexes in Fargo, which are being built like crazy.
Yeah.
So the state level multiplier effects might be there, but not in the region that's kind of left with the aftermath of the resource extraction.
Oh yeah, it's interesting that you said that. So I've not heard that about Fargo. But one thing we did look at is we looked at some housing studies, just comparing Pennsylvania and North Dakota, and that remoteness is a big thing in terms of that multiplier impact, because North Dakota is much more, even like Williston as a remote, excuse me, as a remote area, excuse me, is even the most remote counties in Pennsylvania are not as remote as Williston is in North Dakota. And so what we found is, specifically looking at housing impact, is that the housing impact on Pennsylvania actually wasn't that dramatic like it was in Williston, like you talked about the man camps and the tremendous amount of building they've been doing. Because especially in other areas like Pennsylvania, they have other areas nearby, like cities that already have housing available for them in larger cities nearby. But areas like Williston, that there just really isn't nothing, there really isn't much nearby, so they have to build the man camps. And so the workers, I think, would have to live in that man camp and don't have an area nearby to drive to. So that, the remoteness of the area is a big deal. And North Dakota also happens to be a very remote place, so that multiplier effect is bigger in North Dakota.
Michelle V had a question about whether you did a SAM.
I'm sorry, can you repeat that?
It's in the chat. Michelle says,
Oh,
did you
sorry,
do
I
a
see it.
SAM in addition?
So we actually did, we didn't do, excuse me, an input output. So what we did is we did an econometric model. Oh, I think I have it in my extra slides here. Oh, there we go. So this is actually the model that we did. And so there, if you look at this model, we're taking data, and we did this for Pennsylvania, and then I also did this for all counties across the U.S. On the left-hand side, what we're looking at is we're looking at the change in total employment, or it could be the change in total earnings. And for Pennsylvania, I looked at the number of wells drilled. And then also for all the counties, what I looked at is the number of the direct oil and gas jobs too. And so what we're really looking at here is at this bottom, this equation 3 here. We're looking at the impact of the change in the number of wells, or the change in direct employment, and what that impact is on the change in total employment, or the change in earnings. And so then that's how we actually find our multiplier effect. And so that's one of the methods we did. So another method is down here, which is another econometric methodology. So we use data from Pennsylvania for one study, and then data for all counties across the U.S. for another study.
Okay.
I don't know if that answers
So,
that question. So we didn't do a SAM, and we didn't do the IO. What we did is the econometric methodology.
so on your C, did you control for, or did you interact that with population density to get at some of these differences between?
We didn't, but that's a good idea. So yeah, our C is our county fixed effects. So controlling for how these counties might be kind of different. So we're getting at that counterfactual. We want to control for how is a drilling county different than a non-drilling county, and once we can control for all those things, then we can actually measure what that impact was. And so that's an interesting thing, is like to more specifically look at remoteness. So I looked at it in a new study that I'm actually doing right now. Is we separated it out into some of these areas are non-metro areas and some of them are metro areas. So it's kind of the first initial kind of look we did at that. And the non-metro areas do have a larger impact than metro areas do.
I was also interested or intrigued with the Monterey. I've thought that that would be less likely to be developed because of population density and water constraints. Is that what you're finding as well, or?
This is Don.
Yeah, so they didn't.
Can you hear me?
Yep.
Yes.
I just saw a news thing that downgraded the recoverable oil from that by 96%. And I think part of it was fracking techniques that had worked on the Marcellus and the Bakken were not working there. Plus, you've got.
Is it oil or gas?
Amanda, do you know? I think it's oil. Do you know for sure?
I thought it was gas.
I didn't. Wait,
might
are you
be
talking about the Monterey? So I saw that study on the Monterey in California, but I had not seen that for Texas. So there is development in Texas. So generally, I know just from the industry, I mean, they prefer to stay away from people whenever they can. Um, but that being said, so I'd say it would be kind of a low-hanging fruit thing. So if they can drill and avoid people, they're going to do that. They don't want to have to deal with any lawsuits or any of that if they don't have to. But once they've done that, then they're going to move closer to people.
Mm-hmm.
And don't they need water though as well?
They do, yes. So they need it. Well, so that's another interesting. So they do need a large amount of water. Excuse me. So the last estimate I saw was about 1 to 8 million gallons of water, which is a lot of water. And there was, some complaints about that in Ohio. So the Farm Bureau was big into this, and so a lot of the farmers were complaining. And so the Farm Bureau actually talked to their farmers, and they said, you need to be careful about complaining this, because they actually, looked at it, and the water amount they used was similar to what a dairy farm uses. I don't know if it was annular and whatnot. So they said you have to be careful about the complaining about the water. So they uses a lot of water, but there's a lot of things, in our economy that use a lot of water too. And compared to some of those things, it's not that out of hand.
Okay. And then Michelle had a great suggestion here about a remoteness index, which I hadn't heard about before. So thank you for sharing that, Michelle.
That is, yeah, I wrote that down.
Don, do you have anything further, or Michelle for Amanda?
No,
Michelle is typing.
I enjoyed it, Amanda. Good job.
Thank you.
See what Michelle says.
All right, great. Yeah, she's typing, so we'll give her a